The macabre history of the Redleaf Parish where only the stillborn were baptized. What if there was a parish where joy had no voice, where the bells never rang for the living, only for the unborn? In Redleaf, that was the way of things. The town was small, hidden among forests that seemed to drink in every sound. Life here moved at a slow, uneasy rhythm, but it was not the kind of silence born of peace. It was the hush of grief, thick and lingering, as though the air itself carried the weight of something unspoken. In the heart of the parish stood the church, old stone mottled with moss, its bell tower reaching upward like a finger raised in warning. People would say the bells rang often, yet no one could recall them tolling for weddings, nor for the baptisms of the living. They rang only when a mother delivered a stillborn child. The toll carried not the bright echo of celebration, but a heavy sound that seemed to curdle in the sky, spreading sorrow through every cottage, every field, every hearth. At first, such things were explained as misfortune. Disease, poor harvests, and lack of proper medicine, they said. Redleaf was far from cities, cut off from the kind of knowledge that could ease their suffering. But the number of stillbirths grew until it was no longer natural, and yet no one dared say aloud what they suspected. The parishioners lowered their heads, too afraid to question the one man they believed to be closest to God. Father Aldrich was soft-spoken, a figure of comfort in his black robes. He would walk among the grieving mothers with a hand outstretched, his touch gentle, his words steady. He was praised for giving dignity to the smallest coffins, for wrapping lifeless infants in white linen, for ensuring that every stillborn was baptized and blessed as if they had breathed the air of the earth. To the people of Redleaf, he was their shield against despair, their solace in endless mourning. But history teaches us that evil is most dangerous when it hides behind kindness. The truth of Father Aldrich's work was far darker. Though the townspeople saw mercy in his acts, there was calculation in his every movement. His obsession was not with life, but with its absence. He believed silence was the truest form of devotion, that the purest offering to God was a soul untouched by the world. To him, the stillborn child was not tragedy, but perfection, innocence preserved before corruption could set in. The ringing of the bells was no longer a call for grief, but a ritual in itself, a hymn to silence that only he could truly understand. The church became a place where mothers were guided not toward hope but toward resignation. Father Aldrich would look into their eyes and speak softly of God's plan, of how the little ones were spared the suffering of life. His voice was calm, reassuring, almost hypnotic. He carried himself with such certainty that doubt felt like a sin. Slowly, the parish grew accustomed to the idea that their children were never meant to cry, never meant to live, that Redleaf's fate was to cradle silence in its arms. Behind closed doors, women wept without voice, and fathers dug graves in frozen ground, their hands raw with earth, their hearts numbed into acceptance. And still the bells tolled. Each sound reverberated through the parish like a nail driven deeper into its coffin. The people began to fear joy itself, as if to laugh too loudly, to sing too freely, might invite punishment. Families whispered in their homes, careful not to draw attention, careful not to question why Redleaf was cursed with stillness. The more they buried, the more they surrendered to the belief that this was their destiny. And Father Aldrich watched over it all, a shepherd of sorrow, his eyes reflecting the satisfaction of a man whose doctrine had taken root. The first investigators came years later, drawn by rumors too unsettling to ignore. They walked the narrow paths of Redleaf and found a community where grief was woven into daily life, where no child's laughter broke the silence, where no song rose from the fields. Records from the church told a story more chilling than the whispers, page after page of names, dates, and small baptisms marked for children who had never lived. The handwriting was careful, neat, as if each entry were an offering. The investigators noted how the entries spiked in number during Father Aldrich's tenure, yet the townspeople still spoke of him with reverence, even awe. The paradox was striking, he was both the guardian of their grief and the architect of it. It is here that the story begins, in the parish where bells never rang for the living. Where silence became doctrine, and grief was molded into ritual. Where one man cloaked his obsession beneath the veil of innocence, crafting a world where sorrow was not endured, but cultivated. Redleaf was not merely unlucky, nor was it cursed. It was designed, shaped by a mind that found beauty in silence and holiness in the stillborn. And as investigators leaned closer, peeling back layers of ritual and record, they discovered that behind every toll of the bell, behind every small coffin lowered into the ground, lay not only tragedy, but intention. The story of Redleaf is not about death alone, but about the kind of evil that grows quietly, unseen, because it does not announce itself with violence. It waits, cloaked in care, disguised as devotion, until grief itself becomes the ritual mask. And so, as the bells continued their hollow toll, history was already whispering its warning: when joy is silenced, when innocence is offered not to life but to ritual, something far more sinister is at work. And Redleaf was only the beginning. Father Aldrich was known as a gentle man, a priest whose hands carried no harshness, only the promise of comfort. He walked the narrow streets of Redleaf with quiet steps, offering blessings with eyes that seemed to glisten with compassion. To the grieving, he was a figure of safety, a man who understood their pain more deeply than anyone else could. He held mothers who trembled with empty arms, speaking softly about God's plan, assuring them that their little ones had been spared the cruelty of the world. His voice was smooth and unhurried, his tone low enough that even sorrow seemed to still for a moment. The villagers whispered that Aldrich had the patience of a saint, that no one carried grief so gently as he did. To them, he was not just a priest, but a balm in human form, the only one who seemed untouched by despair. But tenderness can be a mask, and masks are always meant to hide something. Aldrich's mind was not shaped by mercy, but by fixation. His obsession was precise, as if carved into him by something larger than himself. In his theology, silence was not only holy, it was necessary. He began to believe that God spoke clearest through what was not heard, and that the highest devotion was to preserve silence at all costs. In his sermons, he would speak of stillness, weaving words about purity, about the value of uncorrupted souls. The congregation nodded, mistaking his ideas for comfort, not realizing they were listening to the foundation of something macabre. What seemed to them like healing was, in truth, the slow conditioning of their minds. Aldrich was not consoling them, he was preparing them, shaping them into believers of a creed that placed silence above life itself. When he led baptisms for the stillborn, his gestures were strangely exact, his prayers longer than needed, his voice unwavering. Each motion seemed rehearsed, as if part of a play only he understood. He would cradle the tiny body, trace water over the cold forehead, and linger as though savoring the ritual. Mothers thought it devotion. They believed he was granting their lost child dignity, when in truth he was memorizing the sensation of silence in his arms. Each lifeless infant confirmed his conviction that only in death could innocence remain perfect. He stood before the altar not as a man grieving with his people, but as one secretly triumphing, convinced that God had chosen Redleaf as a place of holy quiet. Aldrich's eyes told a different story if one looked too long. Behind their shine of kindness lay something fixed and calculating. He carried himself with a calm so complete it felt unnatural, as though no cry, no grief, no agony could penetrate him. This calm was not the peace of faith, but the control of a man who measured every word, every movement, every pause. He never spoke too quickly, never allowed emotion to crack his voice. He was the kind of man who seemed incapable of mistakes. To the villagers, this made him saintly. To history, it made him monstrous. The first signs of his obsession surfaced in the smallest of details. Parish records showed his handwriting, perfect, unchanging, each line straight, each letter formed with rigid care. No smudge, no slip of the pen. Pages of names of the stillborn filled the church's book, each marked with a notation in the same exact script, as if he had rehearsed the act of documenting sorrow until it became art. He lingered over these records late at night, candles burning down the stubs as he stared at the words, sometimes writing them again on loose scraps of paper, as though rewriting grief made it eternal. No one questioned why the priest worked so late, why the smell of melted wax and ink clung to the church walls long after midnight. To them, he was devoted. To him, he was building a scripture of silence. He moved among the villagers with warmth, but there was no warmth in him. When children were born alive, his visits to their homes were different. Observers later recalled how he would watch the infants with an unsettling stillness, his hand resting on the cradle too long, his gaze following the rise and fall of the child's chest as if measuring the breaths. Parents thought he was blessing their newborn, but his mind was elsewhere. He saw noise where there should have been quiet, imperfection where there should have been purity. His smile, gentle and thin, concealed a darker satisfaction. He knew that in Redleaf, joy was fragile, and silence was inevitable. No one saw it then, but Aldrich was not simply serving his parish. He was testing boundaries, learning how much control he could exert through comfort. He discovered that people who are broken with grief will surrender themselves to anyone who offers order. His sermons grew softer, shorter, yet they lingered longer in the hearts of the people. His presence became necessary, his words trusted beyond question. He had created a system where his obsession could grow in the open, hidden beneath the appearance of care. It was this mask of innocence that allowed him to carry out his true doctrine. He was not a priest tending to wounds, but a collector tending to silence. Every small coffin lowered into the earth was not tragedy to him, but another thread in a tapestry only he could see. And so the bells continued to toll, each ring marking not just loss, but progress in a twisted design that no one else could recognize. And as the seasons shifted, as snow buried the graves and summer heat dried the soil, Father Aldrich's power deepened. The people leaned harder on him, blind to the truth that their comforter was also their architect of despair. They believed they were being healed, when in reality, they were being prepared for something far more sinister, something that would not reveal its full shape until the silence they accepted became the silence they could not escape. In Redleaf, grief did not end with burial. It began with ceremony. The stillborn baptisms were unlike anything practiced beyond the parish borders. To outsiders, baptism was a brief act of faith, a blessing to welcome life into the Church of God. But in Redleaf, life was absent, and yet the ritual grew longer, more elaborate, almost theatrical. The mothers carried their lifeless infants in linen shrouds, their steps unsteady, their faces drained. They should have been the voices of mourning, but they were strangely silent, as though they had surrendered not only their child, but their own right to grieve. In their silence, Father Aldrich's voice became everything. He controlled the space, the rhythm, the words, until the mothers stood like shadows, erased from their own loss. The baptisms could last for hours. The priest would not rush. He would move through every stage with exaggerated patience, lifting the body of the infant as if it were alive, holding it up to the congregation, letting the sight linger until the air in the church grew heavy and unbearable. He would dip the child in water, not once, but several times, each immersion slower than the last, as if he was not cleansing but drowning what had never drawn breath. He whispered prayers so drawn out that they no longer sounded like words but became low, unbroken tones, the language of silence itself. The congregation, overcome by grief and fear, mistook this for sacredness. They believed they were watching holiness unfold. What they did not see was that Aldrich was turning death into spectacle, a theater where his obsession with stillness was played out before an audience too broken to resist. Candles surrounded the font, more than ever needed, their flames flickering against the damp stone. The light created the illusion of warmth, but the church was always cold during these ceremonies, as if warmth itself refused to belong there. Aldrich thrived in that cold. He moved among the flames with a steady calm, his shadow stretching across the walls like a second figure watching him. He arranged the bodies with care, wrapping their limbs, adjusting their heads, positioning them on the altar with the precision of an artist arranging his masterpiece. To the grieving parents, this attention looked like devotion. To him, it was control. Each gesture bound him deeper to his belief that silence was sacred and must be preserved. The mothers rarely spoke. If they wept, it was behind veils, their faces hidden, their voices smothered in their hands. Some were said to faint from exhaustion during the long hours, yet Aldrich pressed forward, his prayers steady, his eyes alight with purpose. When they awoke, they did not question what they had missed. Their silence was expected, even demanded, as though grief itself had been outlawed. To show sorrow too loudly was to disrupt the ritual, to challenge the sanctity of stillness. Slowly, the mothers of Redleaf learned that to grieve in silence was holy, and to cry aloud was shameful. The baptisms became not just acts of mourning, but cornerstones of a doctrine the parish never admitted aloud. Each stillborn was treated as though it were a gift, proof that Redleaf was chosen for purity. The community began to whisper that their children had been spared life's corruption, that they were lucky to give their infants directly to God. This belief did not come from them. It came from Aldrich, repeated through his sermons, reinforced in his rituals, until it seeped into the very stones of the parish. The stillborn baptisms became proof of holiness, and every mother who left the church empty-armed carried not only grief but a twisted sense of pride. Records uncovered centuries later revealed the precision of these ceremonies. Detailed notes, written in Aldrich's meticulous hand, described how long each baptism lasted, how many prayers were recited, how the bodies were positioned on the altar. He wrote of the silence of mothers as though it were part of the liturgy, a requirement that elevated the ritual beyond mourning into something eternal. His writings showed no sorrow, no compassion, only calculation. Each baptism was not remembered as an event, but catalogued as data in his doctrine of stillness. The villagers grew accustomed to this spectacle. They no longer questioned its length, its strangeness, its weight. It became normal to spend half a day in the church for a baptism of a child who had never lived, to watch Aldrich perform with a kind of sacred obsession. The more elaborate the rituals became, the more they believed in his holiness. He had convinced them that silence was holy, that death was purity, that their suffering was not tragedy but divine purpose. What began as grief had transformed into creed. And yet, beneath every whispered prayer, beneath every candle flame, there was something darker. The stillborn baptisms were not ceremonies of comfort but rehearsals of control. They taught a community to see silence as salvation, to accept sorrow as ritual, to surrender joy as if it were sin. Aldrich did not simply lead his people, he shaped them, bending them into a flock that would never question why their children never cried. And as each ritual ended with the tolling of the bells, the sound no longer spoke of mourning. It spoke of completion, of a cycle fulfilled, of silence made holy again. In Redleaf, the bells no longer belonged to the living. They belonged to the stillborn. And through each hollow ring, Father Aldrich's doctrine grew stronger, preparing the parish for a future where silence would not only define their grief, but their very existence. When the first investigators pried open the stones beneath the baptismal font, they expected damp earth, rot, or the crude evidence of hurried burials. What they found instead was something far more deliberate, something that spoke not of panic but of obsession. The chamber stretched low and narrow, carved carefully into the foundations of the church, as though it had always been intended to exist. It was not the chaos of a grave. It was an archive. Every surface was arranged with unsettling precision, and every detail betrayed the hand of a man who believed he was curating silence itself. There was no stench of decay, for Father Aldrich had preserved what he stored there. The remains of infants were wrapped in layers of cloth, dried herbs pressed between folds as if to ward off the corruption of time. They were not stacked, nor discarded. They were posed. Some were arranged in rows, their small hands crossed, their heads tilted toward one another as if in eternal conversation. Others were placed within niches carved into the walls, lying in cradles of stone shaped to hold their tiny forms. The effect was not of a tomb but of a gallery. To stand in the chamber was to feel watched, not by the living, but by countless echoes of silence, each body turned into a symbol within Aldrich's private liturgy. Most chilling was the order. The remains were not placed randomly, but according to patterns that repeated across the chamber. Infants wrapped in white linen always occupied the center rows. Those shrouded in darker cloth were set along the edges. Some were bound with ribbons dyed faint shades of red, blue, or green, their colors faded but still visible under the candlelight the investigators carried. Each grouping seemed to tell a story, though none of the living could understand it. It was as if Aldrich had created his own unspoken scripture, written not with words, but with bodies. In one corner, there was a circle of small skulls, perfectly clean and polished, arranged around a basin carved from the same stone as the font above. It was not blood that marked the basin, but faint traces of wax, as though candles had once been placed there, burning through long nights while Aldrich worked alone. The skulls were turned inward, their empty sockets staring into the hollow basin, giving the impression of witnesses locked forever in silent testimony. No record ever explained why this arrangement existed, but it was clear it had been maintained carefully. This was not neglect. This was ritual. The investigators who entered that chamber wrote in their notes that the silence there was unbearable. It pressed against the ears, thicker than any silence above ground, as if the very air had been trained not to echo. They described the sensation of time slowing, of sound becoming smaller, their own breathing intruding upon a place where breath was unwelcome. Some swore they heard faint ringing, not of bells, but of something duller, like metal striking stone far away. Whether it was imagination or something lingering within the walls, none could say. What mattered was that Aldrich had created more than a chamber of remains. He had created an environment where silence became alive, heavy enough to alter perception. It is tempting to think of such discoveries as the work of madness, but Aldrich's mind was not chaotic. It was methodical. He did not scatter his victims, he catalogued them. He did not hide the evidence of his work, he preserved it with the care of a man recording history. Each placement was chosen, each shroud folded with care, each ribbon tied with hands that trembled not with guilt, but with devotion. This was not the disorder of a killer. This was the order of a priest who had replaced God with silence and built his own scripture from the remains of the unborn. In later years, scholars studying the chamber argued over its purpose. Some believed it was Aldrich's attempt to build a choir of stillness, a congregation of the pure, assembled beneath the very place where baptisms were performed. Others believed it was an archive, his attempt to prove, through careful order, that Redleaf was chosen, that its grief was not accident but divine selection. Whatever the truth, it was clear the chamber was not built to be discovered. It was his sanctuary, hidden beneath the rituals of the church, a world where his obsession could flourish unchallenged. The townspeople had never known of its existence. They had walked above it, praying in the pews, listening to his sermons, while beneath their feet lay the silent evidence of what they had accepted. It was not until the floor gave way, centuries later, that the chamber came into light. And when it did, the illusion of innocence surrounding Aldrich shattered. He had not been a priest of comfort, nor a servant of God, but an architect of stillness, methodically preserving his doctrine in flesh and stone. The chamber beneath the font was not an accident of history. It was the heart of Redleaf's silence, the place where grief was turned into ritual, where death was not hidden but exalted. Standing there, investigators could no longer believe the parish had been cursed. Curses are wild, unpredictable, uncontrolled. What they found was control, precision, and design. Redleaf's silence had not been imposed by fate. It had been built, brick by brick, prayer by prayer, body by body, into something lasting. And it was only in that suffocating chamber, surrounded by the remains of infants posed as symbols, that the true scale of Father Aldrich's obsession began to reveal itself. Father Aldrich's cruelty was never the kind that left blood on his hands or screams echoing down the parish walls. His evil was quieter, slower, designed not to destroy bodies but to erase lives, to transform living people into stillborn memories. His methods were ritualistic erasures, deliberate and patient, so carefully disguised in sanctity that the parish never recognized them as acts of violence. To Aldrich, killing was too crude, too final. His obsession demanded something more unsettling, to unmake a person until they existed only as silence, their lives reduced to symbols in his theology of stillness. He began with the vulnerable, those who were already weakened by grief or isolation. He would offer them comfort, draw them close under the guise of guidance, and then strip away their identity piece by piece. Families whispered of parishioners who grew pale and hollow after long visits with the priest, their voices reduced to whispers, their laughter fading as though drained by unseen hands. Aldrich believed that words carried corruption, that voices stained purity, and so he trained his victims to fall silent, convincing them that speaking was an offense against holiness. Some began to cover their mouths instinctively, ashamed of their own sound. Others retreated into solitude, forgetting how to speak altogether. Their silence was not peace, it was absence, and Aldrich regarded that absence as his greatest work. The bodies he left behind were metaphors, shaped into symbols that suited his doctrine. When those victims eventually died, whether from weakness, despair, or the weight of their erasure, he treated them as though they had been born stillborn. He would lay them out as if they were infants, curling their limbs inward, binding their hands across their chests, sometimes wrapping their heads in linen as though to deny that they had ever spoken or seen. It was a form of rebirth into silence, undoing their years of life until they were nothing more than offerings, indistinguishable from the stillborn he so revered. In his records, he did not write their names as adults. He marked them as returned to purity. In doing so, he erased even their history. His rituals were not quick, and that was their cruelty. The unmaking could take weeks or months, each step a tightening of his control. He would encourage fasting, not as penance but as a means of weakening the body until the voice could no longer rise above a murmur. He would impose long nights of prayer in the dark, hours where his victims were forbidden to speak, only to breathe in rhythm with the silence of the parish. He convinced them that every sound they made was a stain, every laugh a betrayal, every song a wound upon God's ears. And so they surrendered, believing silence was salvation. What they did not realize was that their surrender was his design, their silence his possession. When outsiders looked upon Redleaf, they saw no violence, no rebellion. They saw a quiet town, grieving and devout, guided by a priest who seemed endlessly patient. They did not see the slow deaths of joy, the careful erasures that left families hollow, the rituals that reshaped people into echoes. Aldrich had built a system of cruelty that left no scars, no wounds, nothing that could be condemned by the laws of men. His victims walked into silence willingly, never realizing they were being unmade, their humanity dismantled until it was nothing but stillness in his hands. The most disturbing aspect of Aldrich's method was his calm. He did not act with anger, nor did he revel in suffering. His was the quiet satisfaction of a man fulfilling a sacred duty. He wrote of his work not as cruelty but as theology. In his hidden notes, later uncovered, he described each erased life as a baptism into silence, a ritual cleansing that perfected the soul by stripping away the noise of existence. To him, suffering was not the purpose. Erasure was. He sought not to punish, but to purify. And in that belief, he found justification for every body he left curled like an infant, every voice he silenced, every life he reduced to stillborn memory. By the time investigators began to suspect, the parish itself had grown accustomed to his methods. People no longer questioned why neighbors vanished into silence, why once lively homes grew quiet, why laughter in Redleaf was becoming rarer with each passing season. They thought it was grief. They thought it was fate. They did not realize it was design. Aldrich had built a culture where silence was virtue and absence was holy. And as each life was unmade, the parish itself became another symbol in his scripture, a living body slowly erased into nothing. The method of unmaking was not about death. Death was too small, too final. Aldrich's vision was larger, more patient. He wanted to reshape an entire world into stillness, to prove that silence could be stronger than life itself. Each erased voice was another step toward that vision, another mark in his doctrine. And so the bells tolled on, not for the living, not for the dead, but for the echoes he had created, the hollow spaces where laughter once lived. Redleaf was no longer merely mourning. It was being unmade, one life at a time. The well stood at the edge of Redleaf, a structure older than the church itself, lined with stones worn smooth by centuries of hands and seasons. To most parishes, a well was a gift, the giver of water, a place of life. But in Redleaf, the well became something else entirely. It was a mouth that never quenched thirst, a hollow throat that swallowed without return. Its stones were colder than the earth around it, and its depths carried a resonance that unsettled those who stood near. If you dropped a pebble, it would not simply splash, it would ring, the sound echoing long after it should have died. That strange music became the heart of whispered fears, for families spoke of how parishioners vanished after hearing the chime. It was said they followed the sound, entranced, until they never came back. At night, Father Aldrich would ring the church bells in slow, deliberate tones, and villagers whispered that the well responded. Some claimed they heard the ground hum beneath their homes, as if the earth itself carried the sound into their bones. The missing were always those most broken, those who had lost children or who had begun to question the silence of the parish. One by one, they disappeared, last seen walking toward the edge of town, drawn by something they could not resist. The path to the well was always dark, but they seemed unafraid, as though pulled forward by a promise of peace. In truth, it was not peace they sought, it was escape. Aldrich had learned how to shape despair into obedience, and with the toll of his bells, he offered the well as both altar and tomb. When investigators finally peered into its depths, they did not find water but layers of offerings. At first, scraps of cloth floated near the surface, bleached pale by time, shreds of linen that once wrapped the stillborn. Beneath them, bones gleamed faintly in the half-light, not arranged with the precision of the chamber beneath the font but scattered like echoes lost in darkness. Some skeletons were too small to belong to infants, their lengths matching those of adults who had vanished years earlier. No signs of struggle, no claw marks on the stone, no desperate scratches. Only surrender. The well did not hold the violence of murder, it held the evidence of lives given willingly to silence. Aldrich himself often visited the well in secret. Records later suggested that he treated it as a living thing, a second church beneath the sky. He believed the resonance of its chime was the purest sound, a song made not by voices but by emptiness itself. He would drop objects into it, stones, coins, even fragments of wood from coffins, and listen as the well rang with dull metallic tones, each echo carrying into the night. To him, this was music, the hymn of absence, the sound of silence given body. He was convinced that those who followed its call were not dying but being absorbed, their noise undone, their lives folded into the chorus of stillness that rose from the depths. The villagers grew to fear the well, yet they never dared to seal it. They spoke of it in hushed voices, warning children to stay away, yet at the same time, they felt its pull. On moonless nights, mothers claimed to hear faint crying from within, not of pain, but of infants who had never lived. Fathers swore they heard the echoes of their wives calling from the depths. These voices were not real, but they were convincing enough to lure the despairing to the well's edge. The sound was not loud, it was soft, almost tender, the kind of sound that bypassed reason and went straight to longing. And so, the well became a mirror for grief, reflecting what each listener most desired, drawing them in until silence took them. For Aldrich, the chime well was perfection. It required no blood on his hands, no confrontation, no act that could be named as crime. It was the willing surrender of those who sought relief, the ultimate expression of his doctrine. He had turned despair into devotion, making silence so powerful that people chose it over life itself. Every body lost to the well was not tragedy to him, it was offering. Every echo from its depths was another note in his endless hymn. When the well was finally drained centuries later, its depth was found to be greater than anyone had imagined, a vertical grave where generations had been swallowed. Investigators described its stones as smooth and gleaming, polished not by water, but by the touch of countless bodies passing into its silence. What should have been a place of life had been inverted into a tomb, a space where sound itself was weaponized, where silence had been made irresistible. And yet, the well's true horror was not the bones it held, but the way it blurred the line between choice and coercion. Those who walked into its darkness did so with steps that seemed willing, but behind that willingness was the slow erosion of hope, the careful shaping of minds by a priest who convinced them that silence was salvation. The chime well did not only swallow people. It swallowed their will, leaving behind only the hollow echo of bells that rang above. In Redleaf, water no longer gave life. It gave silence. And as the well deepened with bodies, the parish itself sank deeper into the hollow world Father Aldrich had built, where the toll of bells and the chime of stone became indistinguishable, and where even hope found no voice to resist. Those who survived Father Aldrich's reach spoke not of whips or chains, but of something far more disturbing, being used not for their bodies, but for their voices. He had no interest in screams of pain, no appetite for blood. Instead, he sought sound itself, and then its absence, bending voices into patterns until they broke. In the church's high stone hall, parishioners were gathered under the pretense of prayer, but what unfolded was a ritual designed to harvest echoes. Aldrich would make them chant, not words, but elongated tones, drawn out until lungs ached. He shaped their cries into rhythms, repeating them again and again until the tones no longer belonged to them but to him. And when their voices cracked into silence, he would listen with a satisfaction that chilled those who saw it, as though the collapse of sound itself was the true offering. The children were the most vulnerable. They were brought into the church after the stillborn baptisms, lined along the aisles, and instructed to hum while Aldrich conducted with the calm precision of a choirmaster. Their fragile voices trembled, their humming soft, yet Aldrich demanded it grow steady, unwavering, like the toll of a bell. He corrected them with the gentlest touch, never anger, always a patient smile, but his eyes carried the weight of command. The children began to hum until their throats tightened, until sound faded into hoarse breath. Mothers watched, uneasy, but said nothing. To speak would have been to disrupt what Aldrich had convinced them was holy. And so they stood in silence, watching their children's voices wither. Those chosen for his private rituals fared worse. Survivors described long nights where they were made to produce sounds that Aldrich captured in the church's hollow chambers. He placed them in corners, turned them toward the stone, and instructed them to cry, not words but tones, rising and falling in patterns he dictated. He listened as the stone absorbed the sound, tilting his head, closing his eyes, savoring the moment when their cries thinned into nothing. When the voices were gone, he marked the silence with satisfaction, as though he had harvested something tangible. He spoke often of silence as currency, though no one knew what he meant until the archives were found centuries later. In his notes, he wrote of silence as though it could be collected, stored, and spent. He measured it in moments when a voice gave out, when breath replaced sound, when the air trembled no more. It was not torture in the common sense, but it was devastation. To be stripped of one's voice is to be stripped of presence, of identity. Survivors remembered walking away from the church with throats raw, unable to speak for days, sometimes weeks. Some never spoke again, not from injury, but from surrender. Aldrich celebrated this surrender as the highest form of purity. To him, a voice that chose silence was a soul made perfect. He wrote of such people not as victims but as keepers of the echo, believing their silence carried the weight of the tones they once gave. They were no longer themselves, but instruments emptied and left hollow. The town changed slowly under this practice. Laughter, once faint but still present, vanished. The schoolyards grew quiet, not with discipline but with fear. Children no longer sang as they worked, nor shouted in play. Songs were replaced with whispers, whispers replaced with silence. Even weddings grew quiet, stripped of music, the joy of celebration swallowed by Aldrich's doctrine. Redleaf became a place where noise itself was suspicious, where even happiness seemed dangerous. It was not only death that haunted the parish. It was the hollow that spread in every home, the sense that to speak too loudly was to invite disappearance. The harvest of echoes was more than ritual, it was a system of control. Aldrich had discovered that the destruction of voices was more effective than the destruction of bodies. A dead person was gone, but a silenced one lived as a reminder, a walking testament to his power. The silence of one spread to others, until entire families, entire streets, moved with lowered heads and sealed lips. The absence of sound became contagious, passed from one household to the next, until the parish was an echo chamber with nothing left to echo. Those who tried to resist found themselves isolated. A farmer who once sang to his fields was summoned by Aldrich, and days later, he returned mute, his lips pressed shut, his eyes hollow. A group of young women who dared to sing hymns together in secret were brought to the church, and when they emerged, their voices trembled, breaking into whispers before vanishing entirely. The message was clear, sound was not theirs to give. It belonged to Aldrich, to his rituals, to his doctrine of stillness. The cruelty of it was not in spectacle, but in permanence. The town did not bleed, it withered. The people of Redleaf were not slain, they were hollowed, their voices pulled out of them like threads until only silence remained. Aldrich's harvest was not of crops, nor of souls, but of echoes, gathered in the spaces where cries once lived. He shaped the entire parish into an instrument of silence, playing them until they broke, collecting the hollow that followed as though it were treasure. By the time investigators uncovered the truth, Redleaf's laughter was long gone. The echoes harvested by Aldrich lingered in memory, in records, in the fear etched into every stone. The cruelty was not loud, but hollow, and it left behind a void more haunting than violence ever could. And in that void, silence spread like a shadow, turning a town into a monument to absence, a place where joy itself had been erased. As Father Aldrich's influence deepened, the town of Redleaf shifted in ways too subtle at first to alarm its people. It began with the smallest of absences, a child no longer singing to herself while carrying water from the well, a father who stopped humming in the fields, a mother who no longer whispered lullabies over her infant's crib. What started as a hush of mourning spread into every corner of life. The silence grew contagious, moving from family to family until it seemed woven into the fabric of the parish itself. Joy, once fragile but present, thinned like mist until there was none left at all. The schoolyards, once filled with the shrill laughter of children, became graveyards of silence. Teachers instructed with lowered voices, and children responded with nods, their mouths closed tight. To speak too loudly felt dangerous, even shameful. Games stopped, songs disappeared, and the bells of the school that once rang for lessons were muted entirely. Parents explained it as reverence, as respect for the countless stillborns buried under Redleaf's soil, but the truth was simpler and more chilling. They had been trained to fear their own sound. The silence of mourning had become the law of daily life. Aldrich watched this transformation with calm satisfaction. He had always believed joy was a corruption, a distraction from purity, and to see it vanish from the parish was proof that his theology had taken root. He began to treat laughter as if it were sin. In sermons, he spoke of noise as weakness, describing joy as a rebellion against God's design. His words were not shouted but whispered with precision, sinking deep into the people's minds. Slowly, they began to police one another, shushing neighbors, chastising children, silencing songs before they could bloom. What began as obedience to Aldrich became self-enforced doctrine, a community guarding itself against joy. Those who resisted faced disappearance. At first, it was subtle. A young boy caught singing by the river did not return home. His family was told he had wandered too far, that he must have fallen or fled, yet no trace of him was ever found. A woman known for her laughter was last seen walking toward the church after being summoned by Aldrich. She never re-emerged. Each absence was explained away, each family left to wonder in silence, but the pattern was unmistakable. To make noise beyond mourning was to invite erasure. It was not death in the open sense, it was being absorbed into the parish's hollow design, lives folded into the same void that swallowed voices and joy alike. The cruelty of this system was that it appeared orderly, almost natural. There were no public punishments, no visible blood, no violent spectacle to warn against. Instead, there was only the absence, spreading quietly like rot beneath polished wood. Families stopped asking questions because to ask was to speak, and to speak was to risk. They told themselves it was grief that made the town quiet, that sorrow was to blame, but deep down they knew. They knew joy was being hunted, one laugh, one song, one unguarded cry at a time, until there would be nothing left but silence. Homes grew heavy under this weight. Dinner tables where families once spoke became places of bowed heads and unbroken meals. Fields once alive with songs of labor grew eerie in their emptiness, the wind carrying nothing but the rustle of grass. Even weddings lost their brightness. Couples stood before Aldrich, their vows stripped of music, their celebrations reduced to thin smiles and hushed prayers. The people had not only lost joy, they had forgotten how it felt to express it. The memory of laughter became distant, like a story told by someone long dead. Children suffered most of all. Raised in this world of hush, they grew without ever knowing the freedom of shouting, without the comfort of songs sung to them at night. They became watchers rather than players, mirrors rather than voices. Some stared with wide, unblinking eyes, as if waiting for permission to speak, a permission that would never come. Aldrich had succeeded not just in silencing the present, but in training the future into submission. And through it all, the bells rang only for the stillborn. Their hollow tones became the only sanctioned sound, the only echo permitted to rise above the parish. Every toll was another reminder that silence belonged to Aldrich, that life without joy was the true order of Redleaf. Families stood in the churchyard listening to the bells, their faces empty, their throats tight, as though each ring sealed their own voices deeper into their chests. The disappearance of joy was not a single act, nor a single day. It was a slow unraveling, a deliberate stripping of sound until the parish itself became a mausoleum of silence. Aldrich did not need chains or weapons to enforce it. His power lay in shaping sorrow into a law that could not be broken without consequence. And as the parish bent further into his design, the world above ground mirrored the chamber beneath the font, an ordered space where silence itself had become the only safe language. Redleaf no longer resembled a town. It resembled a grave, a place where life continued in body but not in spirit, where joy was not merely absent but forbidden. And still, beneath the hush of every home, every street, every school, the faintest echo of fear remained, a dread of what might come next, if even silence could no longer satisfy him. Centuries after Redleaf had fallen into ruin, when its parish was nothing more than stone swallowed by moss and wind, a discovery was made that gave voice to horrors once buried. Behind a wall of the crumbling church, hidden within a cavity sealed with mortar, researchers uncovered a bundle of parchment bound in cracked leather. The ink had browned with age, the pages brittle and warped, yet the writing within remained legible. It was not a diary, not the private ramblings of a lonely priest, but something more deliberate, something that carried the weight of instruction. It was a manual. A manuscript not of faith, but of ritual. And in its pages, Father Aldrich's theology of silence revealed itself with chilling precision. The manuscript opened not with prayers, but with definitions. Aldrich described silence as substance, as if it were not absence but matter itself, a holy material that could be harvested, shaped, and stored. He wrote of stillborn infants not as tragedies, but as vessels of perfection, their quietness a currency more valuable than gold. He described the baptisms as liturgies of stillness, each movement recorded like steps in a recipe, down to the timing of the chants and the exact length of pauses between words. To the researchers, it read like the blueprint of a ritual machine, designed to strip sound from the living until only silence remained. What made the manuscript most disturbing was its cold tone. There was no hint of guilt, no wavering of conviction. Each passage was written with clinical clarity, as if Aldrich were a scientist cataloging experiments rather than a priest documenting rituals. He wrote of positioning bodies as though arranging specimens, of binding mouths not with cruelty but with gentle necessity. He described the slow weakening of voices as natural purgation, a cleansing of corruption. Even the chamber beneath the font was detailed in his hand, the placement of remains outlined with the exactness of architectural plans. It was not madness scrawled in frenzied ink. It was order. The most haunting sections were those in which Aldrich spoke of his parishioners as instruments. He explained how to direct a congregation into long tones, how to extend sound until voices broke, and how to savor the collapse into silence. He called this process the harvest of echoes, and he measured it as if it were yield from a field, noting which groups produced more silence, which families surrendered most easily, which children faltered fastest. His words blurred theology and cruelty until they became indistinguishable, devotion used as a tool to justify erasure. The manuscript also contained instructions for the chime well. Aldrich described how certain objects, when dropped, created different resonances, and how those resonances could be used to lure the grieving. He detailed the times of night when the well's sound carried best, and how the tolling of the church bells should be synchronized with its echoes. He wrote that those who walked willingly into its depths were not lost but returned, their silence absorbed into eternity. To him, the well was not a grave but a gate, and he believed himself its keeper. As researchers turned the pages, they found drawings, crude yet precise, of arrangements of bones, diagrams of circles marked with skulls, sketches of infants posed in ritual shapes. Each image was accompanied by instructions, notes on meaning, explanations of how silence could be made visible through form. It was art of the most macabre kind, a scripture of flesh that turned grief into geometry. The discovery of the manuscript forced a reckoning. For generations, Redleaf had been remembered as a cursed parish, its silence attributed to tragedy or fate. But here was proof that it had been crafted, engineered with deliberate care by a man who saw himself not as a monster but as a servant of God's truest law. The manuscript made clear that Aldrich's work was never accident, never madness, but doctrine. And that doctrine had been followed by a community too broken to resist, their silence complicit in their own undoing. Even more unsettling was the realization that Aldrich intended the manuscript to be found. His careful binding, his preservation of ink and parchment, his sealing of the wall, it was not an attempt to hide, but to preserve. He wanted future generations to know, to continue his liturgy of stillness. The manual was not confession. It was invitation. Those who studied it struggled to even speak of its contents. To read the words aloud felt like partaking in the ritual itself, as though giving sound to his instructions risked reviving the silence he worshipped. Museums refused to display it, archives restricted access, scholars debated whether it should be destroyed. Yet copies were made, stored in secret, passed between institutions, its existence too important, and too dangerous, to be erased. The Redleaf manuscript was not merely a relic of cruelty. It was proof of how evil can disguise itself as order, how doctrine can be twisted into ritual, how silence can be turned into weapon. And with its discovery, the story of Redleaf was no longer legend or rumor. It was written fact, ink pressed into parchment by the very hand that had erased a town. But the manuscript raised questions that could not be silenced. Was Redleaf unique, or had there been others? Had Aldrich been alone in his theology, or was he only one of many, hidden in history, waiting to be found? The answers lay not only in the pages themselves, but in the chilling thought that silence leaves no witnesses. When the truth of Redleaf finally surfaced, when the chamber was unearthed and the manuscript dragged into the light, the world demanded a reckoning. Yet what unfolded was not a trial in the ordinary sense, because the crimes themselves resisted language. How do you name what has no screams, no blood, no open wounds? How do you charge a man for silences he cultivated with the patience of prayer? In the courtrooms where Father Aldrich's acts were spoken of, words stumbled and collapsed. Witnesses faltered, jurors sat in dread, and even the judges found themselves unable to shape sentences strong enough to contain the horror. Those who testified spoke with trembling voices, their accounts fractured by the weight of memory. Mothers tried to describe the stillborn baptisms, how their children were held longer in Aldrich's arms than in their own, how the rituals stretched into hours that felt like lifetimes, but their voices faltered into sobs, unable to carry the weight of detail. Survivors of the harvest of echoes attempted to explain what it meant to lose their voices, to be made instruments of sound until silence swallowed them, but as they spoke, their throats grew dry, their words cracked, and many fell silent before they could finish. It was as though the very act of recalling had been cursed, as if Aldrich's doctrine still clung to them, smothering their attempts to bear witness. Prosecutors struggled as well. They reached for language of law, murder, coercion, abuse, but the words rang hollow. Aldrich had not killed with knives, nor imprisoned with chains. He had erased. He had unmade. There was no precedent for such crimes, no statute that could capture the act of turning people into echoes of themselves. To name him a murderer felt too small. To name him a priest felt too cruel. What he had done existed in a space language had never prepared for, and so the courtroom fell again and again into uneasy quiet, silence echoing louder than argument. The manuscript was read aloud, piece by piece, its pages trembling in the hands of clerks. Each instruction, each diagram, each cold sentence of calculation chilled the air. The jurors shifted in their seats, recoiling at the precision, at the calm clarity of a man who wrote of silence as though it were the only true currency. But even then, to speak his words aloud felt wrong, dangerous, as if repeating them risked resurrecting the very liturgies they described. Some demanded the book be burned, others insisted it remain as evidence, but all agreed it was not merely a record, it was a weapon. When Aldrich's defenders attempted to argue, they clung to the mask of innocence he had always worn. They spoke of his compassion, of the comfort he had given to grieving families, of the calmness that had steadied a town broken by loss. They painted him not as architect of horror, but as victim of misunderstanding, a man who tried to ease suffering in a place cursed by fate. But their words cracked against the weight of evidence, collapsing like fragile branches beneath the storm of testimony. Still, the fact that anyone could defend him at all revealed the terrible truth. Aldrich's mask of innocence had been so perfect, so convincing, that even in the face of monstrous evidence, it still deceived. The trial dragged on, not because evidence was lacking, but because language itself resisted the task. To condemn him required more than law, it required invention, a new way of naming evil. Scholars were summoned, theologians debated, philosophers attempted to shape terms that could hold the enormity of his acts. Some called it spiritual homicide, others ritual erasure, others the liturgy of stillness. But none of these words felt whole. The court stumbled through verdicts, writing charges that rang more like laments than judgments, as though they were mourning the inadequacy of their own voices in the face of silence weaponized. In the end, Father Aldrich was condemned not in words, but in absence. He was stripped of name and title, his legacy reduced to silence in the records of the church that had once sheltered him. His memory was marked not by confession but by erasure, his writings sealed away, his doctrine denounced. Yet even in condemnation, silence prevailed. The courtroom itself, after the verdict was read, sat in stillness. No applause, no shouts of relief, no cries of victory. Only the heavy hush of people realizing that the truest punishment for Aldrich was not noise, but the same silence he had twisted into his creed. The trial of silence became a paradox. It was meant to expose, yet it proved how difficult it is to give voice to certain evils. It revealed that some horrors cannot be spoken fully, that they live in the gaps between words, in the spaces where testimony falters and breath breaks. And in that failure, Aldrich's shadow lingered. He had taught Redleaf that silence was stronger than life, and even after his fall, the world discovered how silence could defeat language itself. And so, when the trial ended, there was no sense of closure. Only the haunting awareness that evil does not always shout, that sometimes it hides in whispers, in pauses, in the absence of sound. And what remained was the question that no verdict could silence: how many other Redleafs had existed, their voices erased before history ever learned to listen? When the last echoes of the trial faded, Redleaf was left not as a living parish but as a ruin, a place people spoke of in hushed tones, as though the stones themselves might still remember. Yet even in its desolation, Redleaf carved a mark on history that could not be ignored. Its story became a weight upon lawmakers, priests, and physicians alike, forcing them to confront what silence can do when it is weaponized. The legacy of Redleaf was not only sorrow, it was reform born from the unbearable recognition that grief, left unchecked, could be shaped into doctrine, and that innocence could be used as a mask for cruelty. The first changes came in law. Burials and baptisms were reshaped across the region, their rituals tightened and codified to protect the grieving from exploitation. No longer could stillborns be baptized in ceremonies that lingered into spectacle. Regulations limited rites to simple prayers, brief and humane, with oversight to ensure no family endured endless hours of ritual. Authorities established records not only of births but of stillbirths, no longer leaving them to the hidden discretion of priests. For the first time, silence was acknowledged as something that could be abused, and in that acknowledgement, families found a measure of protection. Psychological care, though rudimentary in those centuries, began to emerge as well. Physicians were called to attend mothers who had lost children, not merely to tend their bodies but to shield their minds. Communities learned to speak of grief openly, to allow wailing and lament where once silence had been forced. The belief that sorrow must be hidden was challenged, replaced by the understanding that expression was not sin but survival. Redleaf had shown the danger of silence pressed too tightly, and so a culture of care began to replace the culture of suppression. The church itself bore the heaviest burden. Aldrich's name was struck from records, his sermons destroyed, his manuscript sealed in archives where only scholars under strict watch could approach it. Yet the stain remained, and leaders could not escape the shame of one of their own using ritual as a mask for erasure. In response, councils gathered to set clearer lines between ritual and obsession, between devotion and domination. Parishioners were taught to recognize when guidance became control, when comfort turned into coercion. The lessons of Redleaf were woven into doctrine as warnings, reminders that even sanctity can be twisted if left unexamined. A memorial was raised on the grounds of the ruined parish, not in honor of Aldrich, but in memory of the voices lost. It was not grand, not gilded with saints or angels. It was a simple field of stones, each unmarked, representing the countless stillborns, the erased parishioners, the vanished who had been folded into silence. Families who traced their lineage back to Redleaf came to lay flowers, to speak prayers aloud, their voices rising where once no voice had been permitted. The memorial was not a place of peace, but of reminder, a vow that silence would never again be allowed to take root as law. Yet even as reforms spread, unease lingered. The manuscript, though sealed, whispered of possibility. Scholars debated whether Aldrich's doctrine had been truly unique, or whether it was merely the one discovered. Stories of other parishes with odd rituals began to surface, hints of practices that blurred grief and control, where silence seemed more than mourning. Redleaf became both warning and question, its legacy both prevention and dread. The most haunting part of its legacy was not the changes it inspired, but the lesson it left etched into memory, that evil does not need chaos or blood to thrive. It can grow in silence, in rituals that appear harmless, in tenderness that conceals calculation. It can root itself in places meant for comfort, shielded by trust, until an entire community is shaped into its image. The legacy of Redleaf was not only what was stopped, but what was revealed, that the quietest evils are often the hardest to see. In the end, Redleaf was left as a cautionary ruin. Its church stood hollow, its wells sealed, its bells fallen silent. But the story lived on, not only in memorials and laws, but in the awareness that silence itself can be dangerous when used as weapon. And so, every toll of bells in other parishes carried a second sound, faint but undeniable, the warning echo of Redleaf, reminding the living that silence must be chosen freely, never forced, and that joy must always be protected from those who would turn it into absence. History often remembers evil by its noise, by the wars, the screams, the burning cities. But Redleaf taught a different lesson, that evil can thrive in quiet, hidden in rituals too small to question, in pauses too ordinary to resist. Father Aldrich never shouted his doctrine. He whispered it, layering grief upon grief until silence became law. His genius was not in cruelty made visible, but in cruelty disguised as devotion. He proved that the most haunting horrors are not those that wound the flesh, but those that erase the voice, leaving nothing but stillness where once there was life. When researchers walked through the ruins centuries later, they found no sound. The church had collapsed into stone dust, the well was sealed, the graves had sunken into the earth. The silence that hung over Redleaf was no longer forced, it was the silence of time, of a place abandoned and forgotten. And yet, standing there, they felt the weight of something unnatural, as though the land itself remembered the hush imposed upon it. The wind seemed muted, the birds avoided the trees, and footsteps echoed too loudly, as if disturbing a sleep that should not be broken. Even in ruin, the parish carried Aldrich's signature, silence as presence. The philosophical reflection came slowly, as scholars debated what Redleaf truly revealed. Some argued it was a story of madness, of one man's delusion infecting a town. Others saw it as a warning of institutions left unguarded, where grief could be twisted into control. But the most unsettling conclusion was the simplest: evil often operates not in spectacle, but in silence. It waits in rituals that seem harmless, in leaders who appear kind, in doctrines that ask only for obedience. It grows not by striking loudly, but by removing the strength to speak at all. Redleaf's story is more than history. It is a mirror. In every age, there are voices urging quiet when questions should be asked, urging stillness when joy should be defended. The parish reminds us that silence, when chosen freely, can heal, but when imposed, it can kill. Evil does not always arrive with chains or knives. Sometimes it comes with open hands, soft words, and rituals that soothe, until the world forgets how to laugh, how to sing, how to resist. At the end of the manuscript, Aldrich had written a single line: in stillness, perfection. It was not confession. It was conviction, the final truth of a man who believed he had erased imperfection from his world. But his legacy shows the opposite, that stillness forced upon others is not perfection, but absence. A town emptied of voices is not holy ground. It is a grave. And so, the tale of Redleaf does not close with resolution. It closes with a question. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could silence, in some form, still be shaped into weapon, hiding behind innocence until it is too late to resist? The answer lingers not in history, but in the present, in every moment when people choose whether to speak or to remain silent.